evening and welcome to the Ops Room, where once again we're here to talk about wargaming in all of its manifestations. I'm Richard Clark and I'm in the chair once again. In the Ops Room, where we talk to historians, writers, military personnel and of course wargamers to discuss our hobby and all of its aspects. Our guest today combines all of those, having served in the British Army for over 30 years. Since 2005, he's been a professional battlefield tour guide, taking groups to such exotic locations as Gallipoli, Normandy, Arnhem, Sicily, Malta, Crete, Monte Cassino, Anzio, to mention just a few. For 11 years, he was chairman of the Guild of Battlefield Guides, and he combined his military experience with that particular skill when running staff rides for the British Army. As an historian, he's had books published on glider and airborne operations in Sicily and the Arnhem, and to crown all that, he's a wargamer. Mike Peters, welcome to the Ops Room.
Hi, Rich. It's really good to be here. I've been following you guys for quite some time, so I'm getting quite a buzz to be on the show. That's good news.
Well, that's nice of you to say that. I'm always worried when people say that in case they're a policeman. But anyway, moving on. Also with us today is the man who's worn out plenty of shoe leather trudging around the battlefields of Europe with me, from Waterloo to Normandy, from Club Route up to Arnhem to the Hertogenwald on the German borders, the Dunkirk perimeter, Cassel, Calais. You've also done Operation Dragoon in the south of France, Mortain in Normandy and the breakout there, the battle for Cherbourg. Famously, he treated his family to a holiday looking at the bridges of Normandy. And what's most remarkable about that is that he's still married. Nick Skinner, welcome once again to the Ops Room.
Hello, and yes, and of all those tours, actually, I've only ever done one with a professional guide. All of that, the rest of it has been me going out with a notebook and a boot full of other books to try and find my way. So really interesting to talk to Mike this afternoon about how that guiding works. And Dragoon in the south of France was a really fascinating one, and one that, of course, you don't get to go to that often. So when you're out in these distant places, it's really important to try and get, you don't want to miss anything, because it's not as easy to go back and do it again, as I'm sure Mike will tell us. But yeah, good to be here again.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when I was over in the States, and myself and a friend looked at the Battle of Brandywine, and you think, while I'm here, you've got to take the opportunity to do it, haven't you? Well, then maybe I'll be doing Eureka Stockade by the time this show comes out. But there we are. Mike, the Ops Room is all about how wargaming and its uses and practice happen both in the hobby and recreational sense, but also in the professional arena. You've certainly transcended that gap many, many times over your career, both wargaming for fun and also being involved in wargaming professionally in the military. Let me start by asking you, before we get on to your many, many talents, which we're going to discuss, but let's first of all talk about what experience of wargaming you had in your military career.
Well, yeah, I mean, like most people, of our vintage. I'm 59 this year, so I started off with Featherstone and Grant and all those great books from the school library and all that stuff, and found that when I joined the military in the very early 80s, that there was a wargaming fraternity. Definitely, people were interested in it, and there was wargaming where what we would call today red teaming, where you come up with a plan on a map and you get the intelligence officer or someone to sit opposite and say, play the enemy partner and try and play devil's advocate, what if, and you try and wargame it in that way. And certainly, even in those early days, there was, rehearsal of concept where people walked through and talked through a plan on a huge map, or even in the case of the Air Mobile Brigade, when I was in that, we had Chinook pilots riding bicycles around a hangar model to say, at this point, the lift comes in and they'd ride in on a bike, and we'd go through the whole thing so people could see where they were. But wargaming in the classic sense of figures on a table, on a model table with dice, etc., was less prevalent. But there was, every now and again, you get some really enlightened commanding officer or OC who'd say, "Why don't we do this? Let's get the War Games Club in and set up the table." And I remember doing that quite clearly back in Cold War Germany, where everybody knew where their crash out areas. We knew where we were going to fight, and we made the models in the training wing, and we played it with models on a thing, what might happen, what would happen if, what would be next. And certainly I remember doing it on Salisbury Plain in the 80s when the first simulated kit came in to simulate, which fitted to aircraft and on people and on vehicles. And we went out and flew Nap of the Earth in Lynx helicopters, which were purely at the time, in doctrinal sense, a defensive weapon. But we'd wargamed it with models and radar, bits of perspex cut out as radar scopes and range, and worked out that actually we could fly Nap of the Earth and get in and hit the target. And we did that for real without a recce because we'd wargamed it. So it goes in fits and starts, and obviously digital wargame is massive across and simulation in the army is huge. But I do think lately, and whether that's because of the pandemic or because of drawdown in defence funding or what, getting people around a table to actually wargame, and partly, you know, without blowing the obvious up to your guys, the rule sets that are out now are far more accessible. And if you link that to things like Band of Brothers and all that, people are more interested in getting into it, and there's a bit more less resistant to say, hey, I've got this idea, why don't we do this at platoon company level and get the boys playing? And I think, as we were talking earlier, actually it's the more junior, lower down the rank spectrum you get, the more willing people are to get involved in it. So I think it's been there a long time. It goes in fits and starts. It's feast or famine, the level of enthusiasm for wargaming per se in a professional sense.
I'm always amazed, actually, having worked with the British Army in terms of developing their analog wargaming. I'm always amazed how the Prussian army got it to happen. Somebody said, yeah, this is going to happen. We're going to roll this out. It's going to be happening in every single regiment, every single battalion across the army. And it did. And you think, oh, blimey, with the poor communications they had of sending some bloke off on a horse to say, make this happen in your battalion. It's remarkable what they achieved in the 1820s, because I don't think we're quite as capable of rolling anything out today as they were then. But yeah, it's very interesting. I think that I've certainly seen the American military is very, very keen on wargaming these days. And I think for any nation who are allied with them, or at least share values, I think that there's definitely some kind of cross-pollination there in terms of ideas. One of the things I'm really interested in, as part of your battlefield touring experience, running staff rides for the military is something that I believe you've done. Is that right?
Yeah, I've done a lot of that.
I think that staff rides is something that hobby wargamers have heard the term and go, yeah, I know what that is, but they only know what that is in the broadest sense. So why don't you inform us? Why don't you tell us what's involved in a staff ride? What format does it take? How do you deliver it?
So if you a staff ride is the high end. There's a spectrum of battlefield touring per se across the military, and staff ride is the high end. So if we start at the bottom, you've got what used to be called the battlefield tour, which is just a load of guys that go off and have a few beers and do a bit of history, and that was fun. And of course, that doesn't stand up to scrutiny by the financiers anymore. So it's, and certainly the Army's not more professional about it. So the battlefield study, so the Common or Garden commercial tour is a battlefield tour. I'd say one level above that is the battlefield study, and that's usually unit specific. So, and that would be rank wise, that would be probably with a major in charge down to private soldier, about 30 or 40 people, depending on the scale you're going to go for, multiples of that. And in fact, I'm doing one in a couple of weeks' time with the Royal Angles. We're going to Naseby with 50 people and 2 guides, 2 historians, and we're going to do a battlefield study, and that's generally aimed at is less complex, and it's at a lower level, usually studying a particular battalion, maybe up to brigade level. But you might, for example, things I've done in the past are fighting in built-up areas. We go to Arnhem and done the Oosterbeek battle in great detail. Talked about house-to-house fighting in some detail. Staying with Arnhem, very common to go and do communications at Arnhem. The myth busting of how the comms was engineered at Arnhem, what worked, what didn't. And certainly when in 2014, when Crimea happened, myself and Peter Caddick-Adams spent most of the year in the Ardennes forest talking to units, NATO units, about how to counter armor in a wooded environment, in the forest environments. So that was battlefield study, and that's getting down to, you mentioned Cassel earlier, that composite force that was holding Cassel, how they did that, how would you do that? Would be a great example of to showcase that sort of thing. The next level up is the battlefield, is the staff ride. Mm-hmm. The name, you mentioned the Prussians already. The name was given by the Prussians, and if you think about the von Schlieffen plan, I mean, that was 1904. That starts, and they're staff riding that from that point onwards. So you're talking, rather than taking a complete army corps across countryside, you take the headquarters and they go on horseback. Right. So a brigade commander, or a divisional commander, a corps commander will take all of his headquarters out on horseback, and they'll ride. And some of these things would take 7 to 10 days. And they say they ride over ground that they've expected to defend or fight over if they've already had it, or ground that was similar to how they might fight, and study that as a formation headquarters. So in modern terms, and it's very, very big business in NATO, spent a lot of time in the Baltics pre-pandemic, looking at the defence of the Baltics, and to do that, we looked at the Germans going in 1940 and going out, and then the Russians coming in 1944 across the Narva. So we were on the Narva with NATO headquarters talking about what happened in 44, because technology changes, but ground never changes. No, the human factors never change, So when you're setting up your wargaming, the factors, these things don't change, do they? It's just the technology and the ranges that change, and it's the same in warfare on the ground. So a staff rider's got higher aims. There will be a difference in composition and tech. So a battlefield study will have a lot more cordite, blood and gore, and human factors and more stories, a little bit more humorous stories, etc. You still want that in a staff ride, but a staff ride will be about the C2, the command and control, the organisation, the doctrine that was used, and really you're there to study failure and success, what worked, what didn't, and why, and a compare and contrast between the two. And on an ideal staff ride stand, which is what you call the places you go, you may have 4 or 5 stands in a day. You may do the question first, you may do the history, then do the question, and it's not always related. You might do an example, like I don't know. Let's just say, pick an example. Let's go to Hougoumont, talk about defence, and you might talk about Hougoumont and McDonald and all the guys and how they defended that, and then the skirmishes outside and the Nassau and all these different things. And then the question will be a similar scenario, but with modern equipment. It doesn't always translate, so you have to be careful how you engineer that. You want something that's going to be, so on the Narva, it was about defending a river obstacle against attack, and how that was done. Having seen how it was done in 44, how would you do it now? And the subsequent questions. And there's always, so that will have been built up before you even got to the point of destination. You'd have had a study day back in UK or back in home base, which the Baltic ones was in Warsaw, where the experts are brought in to talk for a whole day and lecture, get people immersed in the culture of the time, doctrine of the time, and also there'd be a reading list. People be given a reading list to go through, and occasionally a war game where you go through to you familiarise yourself with the tactics and doctrine. The thing that, go on, Nick. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question on that, Mark, if you can, because so you're describing this event that's back in the UK or back somewhere else that's kind of in wargaming terms almost like a briefing, where you're giving people the opportunity, I think you said, to become aware of the doctrine and the flavour and to immerse in the period they're looking at. So my thinking was, what it sounds to me like you are describing almost a briefing. What we'd like to do in Kriegspiels, etc., is to put the players in the mindset of the guys who were there on the day. So what you're trying to do is create that situation where they have an awareness of that, a much deeper understanding of the limitations that are on them as commanders. Is that what that's all about?
Yeah, it starts off in simple terms. People find it easier to assimilate facts and figures. So you're giving them the ranges, the equipment, the capabilities. Okay. But then, for example, if you're doing Sicily, there's a great book, the American handbooks from World War II, which explain the British Army. I always dish those out, and it's got all the idiosyncrasies, but it's also got the orders of battle, how many universal carriers, how many anti-tank guns, all of this. and say, okay, this is your kit. You are a battalion. This is your piece of ground. You don't know how it's happened. How would you do this? And then they come back with their show workings after an hour discussion, etc. And don't forget, they've got their own mortar officer, their own anti-tank guy, etc. And they've done the study day. They've done a bit of reading. So they go, okay, this is how we would do it. And you say, all right. And you can't say that they haven't gone away and read the solution anyway, or read the history, but you can say, now you're on the ground. Now you can see the folds in the ground. Now you can experience the weather, and you can see the visibility limits, constraints. How would you do it? And
do you find that they generally come to those sessions with a good awareness of the material in advance, or are they, for instance, you're taking a group to Naseby? I know you said that's next level down, but what kind of awareness have they got of some of this history?
I'm not expecting anything at Naseby.
No, I think you probably won't be disappointed.
Well, some of the others, I mean, are they generally well informed, or are you dealing with a?
Well, one of the things you do as a staff ride operator is you produce the reading list, you do the study day, and you also produce what's called the reader, which is like a consummate book, depending on how long you've got, which has got all this information in it. And you know that some of these guys are either too busy, too lazy, or whatever, and they won't read it till they get on the plane. So it's in a digestible format. They've been to the study day, they've had the syndicate sessions. But you've got usually 4 or 5 days to build it up anyway. And the thing that a lot of novice historians make the mistake of is thinking they're there to learn the history. They're not. They're there to discuss modern tactics, modern weapons, and etc., and to understand the history is there as a provocation, a catalyst to make them think that, to stimulate them. I mean, one of the best ones I did was I took the Fleet Air Arm down to Gallipoli and talked about aviation expeditionary operations at reach, at the end of your logistics supply chain. And we talked about working off ships, working off airfields ashore, and then what happened when the Royal Flying Corps arrived. A couple of staff officers said, hey, we've learned all these lessons on the Western Front, and this will work much better here if we centralise command and centralise photo recce, we do all this. And the Navy are like, speak to the hand, don't want to do that, Army, we're not going to do that. And coming from an aviation background myself at Army, I was talking to a bunch of Navy guys and said, and we had all that banter, but we also talked about joint helicopter ops in Afghanistan, Bosnia, and all these different, and how that had evolved from Iraq to Afghanistan, and how much things had changed and how integrated things were, and compared it to those lessons of 1915.
And of course, all those other subsequent conversations are all enriching the learning as well, aren't they? So in some ways, it's a conversation starter, a lot of this. Yeah, interesting.
I mean, I've done a lot of corporate stuff as well, very high-end corporate management training. And staff rides and corporate management training are very similar in respect that whoever's taking them away, whoever the head honcho is, they want to get their people away from a screen. They want to get them out somewhere different to stimulate discussion. And, whereas about 20 years ago, if you've gone on a staff ride, you could expect to work till 10 at night on your question and write your orders for the next day that you were going to present. Now it's no, we do a full day on the battlefield. We then go out and socialise, have a bit of culture, have a meal, and talk, and get into it. And what people do a bit of reading for the next day, but it's not as regimented as it was. It's more about stimulating thought and professional development. That's
a really good point, because often, we might have ideas in the workplace, but the time that we actually share those ideas with other people is when we've got that social environment in which we've actually got time, because we're not thinking about what we should be doing during our working day. We've got time to actually just chat around those ideas, and that's when two heads become better than one, and ideas develop, and take it from there. One thing I was really interested about was your comment about how terrain never changes, and effectively, the problems of the ground are a constant, whatever period that you're talking about. And I think that's really interesting, because my experience of wargaming in the military is that they're always, when they use a wargame, it tends to be as preparation for the next operation that they feel that they're about to be or potentially about to become involved in. And of course, it's I always think that they're missing a trick, because we can use historical wargaming to take people away from the issues of today and put them into an entirely hypothetical situation in which they're able to think more freely because they're not constrained by the doctrine that they're operating within. And that's what I've always seen historical wargaming as an opportunity that the military are missing, because they tend to want to focus on, well, this is what we think we're going to do next, which is why we're looking at, forests in northeastern Europe. When maybe, studying El Alamein might present them with different issues that they hadn't even thought about and hadn't encountered. So I think that my soapbox there is that by using historical scenarios, we can actually stimulate more free thinking and people thinking outside the box. So tell me, when it comes to running battlefield tours for or battlefield visits for the corporate sector, are they being expected to come up with plans and do the same thing that the military, or is this something else? How does that work?
Generally, so for a favourite that I've done quite a few times, two that I do a lot of, is Waterloo, where people want to talk about coalition, and the different leadership styles between the two senior commanders, long screwdriver or not, and devolution of command, etc. So is generally what I mean. You go and stand in Le Caillou in Napoleon's headquarters. That's a board meeting around that table, and you get your board around that, and there's a picture on the wall, isn't it, of Napoleon not listening to anybody. And it's okay. It's truth to power. And then the thing about Wellington, has he told everyone his plan? Is he everything hinges on him being in the right place at the right time. And which one are you? And one of the funniest things I've ever done at on the Waterloo one was with the Global Engineering Company, and we started the night before at Linney outside the museum. We were going to have wine and a meal there. We stood around that 9-pounder outside Linney, all having a chat, and I was doing full-on historian mode, talking about Napoleon and Blucher and Wellington, all their personalities, talking about Napoleon. And I foolishly said, and of course everybody knows about Napoleon, and his hand came up in the audience, and it was a guy from South Korea. Said, no idea who he is, not a clue. Much to the shock of me, not only me, but the French CEO who was in the audience as well. And that was a great moment to say, okay, you need to think before you speak, and most of the people in that group were from the Pacific region and had no interest in Waterloo. So it was great for them to be there, but I had to really adjust my pitch level to do that. The other one is Normandy, and a great thing to do in Normandy, I've done this with a very well-known social media company, and that's resistance to change and innovation. You get into Percy Hobart and the Omaha Beach and all this, and compare and contrast and the British Canadian doctrine, the way they went about the business, and even things like segregation of the US Army. So they're not looking for people to make plans, but it's more about personalities. Eisenhower as a coalition commander.
Well, the Wellington one is an interesting one, isn't it? Because Wellington really, if you think about the behaviours you'd like to encourage in good wargamers, and you look at what Wellington does and the way that he behaves, it's completely the opposite. Imagine if a player on one of your war games behaved like the Duke of Wellington does in terms of his, not sharing his plan or what have you. It's quite kind of interesting then when you kind of compare that style.
We've all met that person, isn't it?
It's him. It's him. That's what I was just thinking. That's like gaming with him every week.
No, boys. The other way. But it's the human aspect of it that comes out. And I think every time we play different Kriegsspiels and you put somebody in that chair, their underlying beliefs and values really come out to the fore. And it's a great way to look at sort of personal leadership and say, actually, put this person in the spotlight and see what happens.
I think that's very true, and that's what you try and show, because when you do a battlefield study or battlefield tour, whatever it is, you generally find yourself talking about the weather of the ground, but always about the human factor, the commanders or the individual soldier who decides, I've had enough of being shot at, I'm going to get up there and go and sort that machine gun out. Why did he do that? What motivated him?
Well, typically as war gamers, or on a on a battlefield tour or staff ride, you say, well, why didn't they do this, that, or the other? Surely it's obvious that you should, but of course it isn't obvious. You know, why does Urquhart go and get stuck in the loft? How does that happen?
That's a favourite of mine.
Well, there's a whole load of things about that, but of course it's, with hindsight, we can all say how ridiculous it was that could ever occur. But then when you're on that, put that man in that spot, in that situation, you get that bizarre outcome.
Well, you have to ask yourself for that particular one. It's a great one to do on a staff ride. Is, Urquhart goes, but where are his brigade commanders at that time? They're all doing the same thing. They've all gone forward. Where's Gough? They've all left their command posts and all gone forward. And why are they doing that? Why, so it's a great question to, Lathbury's gone, and they're all, and Gough's gone forward. They've all disappeared to make sure everything's going as it should do. Or is it because the things aren't going quickly enough? It's.
And I guess when you're there on the ground and you're actually making that journey, from Wolfhazer down to the Rhine Pavilion there, to that front line position, you get a real sense of what's happening, don't you? Because you get the distance and the magnitude of events just comes out really clearly.
Well, this is the key, I think, because we can all pick up a history book or watch a DVD or a documentary. And the two things that wargaming and staff rides have in common is 3 dimensions. You can actually see the ground. When you guys went and set yourself up at Oosterbeek in the museum on the ground and then had people wandering in, but they're then looking at a 3-dimensional model, and you might get in the digital screen, you're going to get, but you don't get the feel and the look and left and right 360 degree at the same time.
That's exactly my experience at the Airborne Museum at the Hartenstein, was the fact that I honestly felt that the people, the general public who were attending the museum on that weekend when we were there, learned more about the battle from looking at the games, the war games, rather than looking at weapons in cabinets and a large selection of medals, because it made it come to life. It almost reanimated the action that was happening on that day.
I mean, animate's a good phrase because it's interactive and it's 3-dimensional. Yeah, and it makes you think, because you're not just reading it off a screen or a page, and that is important. Understanding those weapons and looking at it, feeling the weight and all that kind of stuff, very important. But I do think and battlefield studies and wargaming are experiential. It's great to say. I mean, I say terrain doesn't change. Waterloo has changed a little bit since the battle, with the Lion Mound there, ruining Wellington's battlefield. But if you set off from the French side, from the Grand Battery, and actually walk across the fields, and then you go into that dip, and suddenly you can't even see the Lion Mound. Suddenly the penny drops. You'll go, I get it. And you don't get that from a book. You don't get it you certainly don't get it from the film. And you have to walk the ground. You have to see that Lion Mound disappear from you. Then you go, now I understand the sunken lane. Now I understand the Grand Battery. It can't see Hougoumont. I get it. Yeah. And you can only get that on the ground itself, or as you say, with a proper 3-dimensional battlefield table that you guys generate.
Yeah, that's certainly my experience when we walked Waterloo was of exactly that. You almost get the feeling that once you're on that road, it's a real battle of two halves, and that road almost separates the two halves apart. One of the things I was going to ask you was that Nick's already alluded and mentioned the fact that he and I have only done one battlefield tour with a battlefield guide, and that was this year in Arnhem. Before that, we've really done it under our own steam, doing our own research and looking at what we want to look at. Do you find that when you're running battlefield tours for the general public, or not so much the military, but okay, let's go with the general public, do you find that every individual battlefield tourist has got their own agenda? Some people are looking at Uncle Bill, and some people are looking at Napoleon because he's their hero, and some people are just there because they just saw it advertised in the newspaper and thought, I'll give it a go. How do you deal with all those different agendas that everybody's got?
It's a good question, and I know you've talked to Julian Whippy about this kind of thing, haven't you? When he has battle honours and runs that talk. So if you went on and you went, your guide, you chose Luke Boost, didn't you? So I mean,
yeah, we did.
Yeah, that's a win-win scenario, isn't it? If you're going to talk about Oosterbeek, Luke is the man to go with.
Yeah,
and is a great friend of mine. But
very nice guy. Very nice.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But you've got that encyclopedic depth, and if you've got a good historian battlefield guide, they're not there to impress you; they're there to help you understand. And you find people. There are good guides and bad guys. You find these people who say, "I'm going to impress you with all the knowledge I've got," and just talk at you for the whole day. And that's not what you want.
No.
You want a storyteller, and you want someone who's accurate in everything they say, but is also going to judge the audience and work that. And people do come with these different agendas. And sometimes, I've done a lot of Anzac tours. The Australians won the war. The Great War is won completely by the Australians. Those 5 divisions did more than any of the British or the French could do. But actually, that when you start, and if you're working on a 5-day cycle or even 10-day tours that I used to do, by the time you get to the end of the first few days, they're going to realise that you just chipped away at it, and you've just keep pushing information out and showing them examples, showing them the ground. Maybe the Brits weren't quite that bad, and lions led by donkeys is not quite as they thought it was. And there's nothing more satisfying at the end of the 10 days. They come to you and say, "I'm going back to Australia, far more enlightened than I was. I now understand Gallipoli or understand the Western Front or whatever."
Can I ask a question there, Mike? Do you feel that you have to dumb things down? And if so, does that frustrate you when you have to do that? Because it's not watching, for me, that'd be like watching something on the TV, which has dumbed it down so much that it's now, it's kind of, it's so basic that actually I feel, oh God, there's no point in me.
If you're on a day trip, if you're working in the schools market, that's a real factor. Is the pitch level. And when I train battlefield guys, one of the things I talk about is the pitch level. And when they do their training exercises, they get on their brief what they're talking about, where they're going to talk about it, and who they're talking to. So it'll be a school group, an adult commercial group, or a military group, and they've got to adjust accordingly. And then within those bands, you then got to adjust again people who are hard of hearing. If you get a group of Saga louts who are all in their 60s or more, you've got a totally different agenda, not least where's the next toilet stop. All those logistic things that affect it, and varying degrees of knowledge. And you'll get the complete anorak at the back, who's like, "Oh, I know, he knows better than you do," and trying to trip you up the whole time. And you'll get the partner off who's just here because, he told me we were going to Holland to look at tulips. Well, there will be some tulips on the landing zone, but you get a real, and certainly in the commercial world, in a group world, schools or military, you've got a group leader, you've been involved in the planning, hopefully in the itinerary, you know what you're getting. In the commercial world, you've got 50 potential individual learning outcomes and agendas, and they've paid for it. They expect it. Now, if you're working for one of the big commercial companies, the itinerary is fixed, and you're sort of protected and constrained by that. Because I'm sorry, I'd love to take you somewhere else to show you the artillery fire plan, but it's not. We haven't got time. We've got to be here by then or whatever. But if you're in one of the more specialised companies, you say, "Oh yeah, we'll change that program. If everyone's amenable, we'll go off and do a pilgrimage and find out where your uncle got. I'll show you the field where he got the military medal." And I've done that many times, and all the good guides do that.
You mentioned what level are we pitching at? Are we talking school group? Are we talking military? There's going to be a world of difference between the two, but there must be the same sense of satisfaction when you finish the tour, and whoever you're pitching at comes away better informed, with a better understanding of what happened, and also hopefully a greater interest. And to an extent, that sense of satisfaction must be even higher when you're talking to school kids than when you're talking to a bunch of colonels and half colonels.
I think you're right. And I mean, don't get me wrong, school groups can be quite testing, but at the end of the day, when you're taking a really rowdy inner city school, and they're not the only rowdy ones, rowdy all sorts, but one high-end school group who on the allergy sheet it had cheap champagne as an allergy,
Mm.
But you know, at the end of the day, and they usually repeat booking, so you see the same teachers the next year, and they say, "Oh, they went back, and the coursework went through the roof. It was really good. They understood it. You know, they'd really engaged." And actually, you know, one of the things I always tell trainee guys is just because they're in the military doesn't mean they understand history or they know anything about, and they don't. Because people don't join the army to do history.
No.
You know, they join for whatever reason they join, whether it's to play rugby or whatever they want to do. That's what they join, and they find themselves on a battlefield study. So you've got to get them involved as well. So yeah, it's a huge satisfaction. I mentioned the Aussies and Canadians and Brits, American customers, you know, and they go away and you've challenged it. And the Aussies are always like, they'd always say to me that on day one, and usually pick them up in Paris or in Istanbul, they say, "Oh, we've got a Pommy guide. What's that about?" And at the end, they say, "It was so good to have a different point of view to what we hear back in Canberra from the AWM or whatever, just to not the Anzac-ery." You put it all in context, and I come away, and I said, "Well, actually, most of them were Brits anyway. They've only been in Australia a couple of years or whatever. They were, you know."
The proportion of men serving in the AIF was heavily skewed towards British. A lot of British expats. I mean, obviously, a lot of born Australians, but an awful lot of people who are relatively new.
The same is true of the Canadians, and some of these guys were the imperial family. You were moving around the empire, working, mining, whatever you're doing. And most of them still had British passports or British citizenship. So, but you know, with the Aussies as the example, they start the war as Australian, as British, and they finish the war as Australians. You know, and the story about the Versailles Treaty being the first treaty they signed and all that. And most Aussies don't know that.
Yeah, it's a real part of the coming together of Australia as a nation, isn't it? Because I mean, the Boer, when they served in the Boer War, they were serving as individual states, weren't they?
Yeah.
And so the Great War really was that melding together of the Australian nation, wasn't it? A real
federalisation is 1911, and most people say, you know, "Oh well, you're not a nation till you've invested your treasure in your blood." You know, and they certainly did that, didn't they? So that's why the Gallipoli and the Vimy moment, all these things are so important. And Monash, another story.
Can I ask another question, Rich?
Yeah.
We're able to do the staff rides and battlefield tours of the Second World War so well because so much is documented and left available. And you might say not enough is left available, but there are things that we can use, artifacts that remain. Naval and Military Press, for instance, have published the British Army, the Rhine.
They're really good. They're gold dust.
They're absolutely brilliant. I'm lucky to say that over Christmas I've now got a full set of those. What's going to be the future then? I mean, who's producing this material today for the battlefields of today, and are they going to be walkable in the future?
Battlefields of today, well, I don't see myself going back to Iraq anytime soon. But you make a good point about archives and information. I mean, I do Agincourt a lot, and there's all the Shakespeare side of it, and there's all the other bits. It's really good to get in and dig out stuff and do that. And the Great War is heavily documented, as you both know.
Yeah.
And the op orders are there, and the packet, and of course there's all the personal correspondence you could pick on. I mean, I was in Iraq in 2003 as a signals officer, and I was responsible for writing the war diary for our battle group. Yeah, so I made sure I kept it all, and we wrote it well at the end. But what I will say is, the lesson I learned from that, and I say to every single guide I've ever trained or who'll listen to me is, they're great war diaries for grids, times, places, numbers, etc. But no one's going to run themselves down in a war diary. You don't say that the regiment was rubbish that day or the RSO didn't do his job. So that you've got to go and find other sources. And that's the thing that, going back to your other question about what does a guide or a historian give you, that's what they give you, because they've gone off and pulled all those threads together into that narrative for you and taking you to the right place to stand in it. So you've got that overview to do that zoom in thing I mentioned about, and to time, place, context all together and tell you the story. That's what they're there for. But future battlefields, well, people go to the Falklands, don't they?
They do. Yeah, friend of mine, funnily enough, an Australian, He's been to the Falklands and done the battlefield tour in the Falklands.
And you can walk that. And I've done Israel, I've done Palestine 1917, but you're standing in one set of trenches and say, what are those over there 1948 trenches? And so there are places you can go if you want to look at modern, inverted commas, battlefields. And it's interesting that when the First World War Centenary was going full tilt, I kept saying, I was the boy that kept farting in church and saying, what about the World War II veterans? They were dying at a prodigious rate in 2014 to 18. No one's looking. Everyone's talking about Harry Patch. But no one was looking at the World War II guys, and that's, I think that penny's dropping now, and hopefully Masters of the Air and all the rest of it will bring people back into that mindset. And we shouldn't decry, you mentioned school groups earlier, the computer games that these kids play, that it gets them into wargaming, it gets them into battlefield touring, etc., and the history. So, as Rich was saying earlier, what about school groups? The whole thing about kids today, they don't know this. This generation now, and the one 10 years ago and 15 years ago, they stood under the men in gate. It's in the school syllabus. They go and do it, as do the young military recruits. Our vintage, I never got to go on a battlefield study as a kid. Battlefield tour, it was my school, so, and it wasn't taught. I remember doing Norman clock rotation, but I didn't do the Schlieffen plan. So
at least you won't invade France then. I suppose.
No.
So you made great cider.
Yeah. But going back to the original question, what does a guide add? I'd say, unless you're and even some of the published authors you hear about, I've taken them on tours and they say, "Oh, I'll let you into a secret. I've never been here before. I've never walked the ground."
No.
Yeah, you do. You do. You do get that. So, and you say, "Really?" And they say, and they definitely never wargamed it. So and when people talk to me about Sicily, I'll say, "Have you actually seen the ground?" And we talked about the dip of Waterloo. Those places, lots of the time, you just go, you have to be there, experience the weather. See, well, why did they do that? So, well, actually, you can't see Hougoumont from there. Really? No, you can't. And if you read the accounts, I'll go back to the accounts and say the French cavalry were driven back at dusk by English cavalry. British cavalry. They never got to see what Hougoumont. Hence, they attacked without ladders and all the rest of it, and all the other things. So that's what a guide historian gives you, is that, and the ability to link. If we were doing 3 days of walking over Gallipoli, I say, well, actually, at this time at Suvla, this is the East Anglian division is landing, and this is what's happening here at the same time. Because unless you studied it all your life, and Luke's a great example as a historian who has lived it, slept it, and breathed it. He's going to take you. What do you want to know? How much do you want to know?
That's what I found with Luke, was that it was although we're familiar with the Battle of the Northern Perimeter that we looked at in detail with him, and we've walked that, we walked many of those streets. In fact, Rich and I did many of those streets the morning that we then did the tour in the afternoon. We went out, we'd been out with our camera in the morning to look around. But what we got with Luke was the ability to construct the story that then made so many of those individual instances that we knew about come into place. So for instance, what he gave me, what I got from that tour most definitely was an absolute understanding of the way that the Northern Perimeter at Arnhem crumples, much in the same way that a car is designed to crumple. It doesn't just it's not an ad hoc collapse. No. It's actually a structured crumple. As
Urquhart came up later with Berlin, the balloon deflating idea was
and actually I really whilst I think I knew that, I didn't really appreciate it until we went through it with Luke, and it added that extra something which really was an extra things in my head that made the whole picture become so much more.
So any of the guys I've trained will know exactly what I'm going to say to you next. So I just hammer it into them time and time again and say, when you walk onto a stand or you meet a group, you start off with, where are we geographically? And that's quite big. It's big scale. So then you say, when are we? Chronology. Who are we? What's happening? And so what? So you start off big and you're zooming in until you get to the guy with the bayonet or the grenade or whatever. and then you zoom out and go, so what? And then you get on your coach, or you walk to the next stop. You say, okay, we've just come from here. Where are we? And you're linking. So the intent is that when you get back to the hotel that night, people should be asking you questions, but they shouldn't say, oh, I didn't get any of that. Where did we go? You know, you'll always get one, but you know what you want is a narrative that makes sense. You know, and the number of people who say to me, I'm going to the East Salient and I'm going to do this, this, and this, and I say, well, you're actually going from you're starting in 1917, you're going to 1914, then you go into 1950.
Yeah,
you want to understand this. It's always, and as a commercial tour operator, it's always geography versus chronology. You want to do it chronologically to make it sit well and as a story, but geography, fuel, time, legit tourist infrastructure messes with that, and that's why I was used to throw at the guides every night, say, okay, we're going to these places tomorrow, plan it, and they come and say, here's my plan. Okay, I'm Mr. Snodgrass, I don't want to go there, I want to go to, I've got a pilgrimage, and you told me I'd do that, now what are you going to do? All right, you know, somebody's missed the boat coach, all these things, but so that's what's always going on. But
do you ever find that sometimes you're confronted with people having an agenda that they want to push in terms of history? I'm thinking of that. Let me explain that one a bit better. I was at one of the First World War cemeteries once, and there was a teacher there saying, look at all these, you know, isn't this terrible, all these people who died, and there are no officers here. This was the officers were pushing the men into the sausage machine.
yeah.
And I was annoyed, but not annoyed enough to punch him on the nose, which I still wish I had done. I'd be feeling better about it today if I had. But do you sometimes find, especially with the First World War, that people want to believe that lions led by donkeys, and there's pushback against you explaining that it wasn't really like that?
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, a classic example, I remember when I was did a lot of work in the schools market, picking a group up at Mason Services, and it was me and a guy who was a very senior retired lieutenant colonel. We were the two historians, and it was the morning that Johnson Bahari had been given his VC.
Oh, yeah.
Newspapers, and I was still a serving officer at the time, and I heard this voice from the back, and it was the English literature teacher. It was the classic Lions Led by Donkeys specialist, and was very into Siegfried Frassoon and all the rest of it. And I was saying to Phil, I said, well, this is great news, isn't it? And he said, I suppose you guys would be disappointed that a non-officer had got a Victoria Cross, you know, or you know, surprised. And I said, you turn, and I was similar mindset to you. I put my newspaper down. I said, well, clearly you don't know the story of the Victoria Cross. Went back to the origins of the Victoria Cross and said, and actually, as an ex-soldier, now an officer myself, I think I'm quite qualified to say that this is a good thing. It's a great story, and everyone in the army will be chuffed to bits. Blackadder goes forth as a big thing to deal with for a long time. Not so much now; kids don't watch it anymore.
No,
that you know, and that's all. That satire, and what people don't understand about satire is it's accurate, but it's satirical. It's not, you know, it's not the truth. So you do get it. I mentioned the Aussies earlier. There's a, you know, again that's a tide that's slowly turning. They're beginning to understand that their part in it was important, but you know, a lot of them don't know their own history.
I think that's part of a national foundation myth, isn't it? Every country likes its own foundation myth, and the younger the country, the louder the call that myth has.
Very true.
So that's understandable, and we've got to be careful what we say, because I'm going to be releasing this when I'm in Australia. So let's move swiftly on.
But we can talk about Canadians as well if you like. But
yeah, we can. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'm going to be going to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and that's going to be one of the highlights of my trip there. So I'm hugely looking forward to that. But wargamers on battlefield tours, do you get many wargamers coming along?
Oh, you do. I usually diffuse any situation by saying, actually, I'm a wargamer. What rules do you use? And we start talking about it like that, and talk about the terrain. You do get a lot of wargamers on it, and I think it's good because generally they want to understand.
Yeah.
You know, you get into a trench complex or somewhere, or you talk about, I mean, the great one, Hexus Bridge, you know, and I'll drag them kicking and screaming to Halser Bridge. So there's two bridges.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do my glider pilot regiment bit, you know, I have to do that and talk about all of that. and talk about Sicily and Dieppe and all those things that people want to talk about. But yeah, wargamers are good news generally. I mean, I've not had a bad wargamer. They can, you get the odd anorak who's completely obsessed with what was in the left-hand ammo pouch of that platoon on that day, and you're like, well, not really here to do that. We can talk about that at the bar if you want.
That's definitely not
me.
We
can talk about that at the bar later, but we're here to tell the story and understand that, and like I've walked down Villas Bocage and done the Wittmann battle many times, and trying to make them understand what it's like to fight an armored vehicle, to be inside an armored vehicle during a scrap like that, and how that works. It's I've done a lot of time on armored vehicles in my time, so it's good to do that. And I'm lucky I've done a lot of aviation as well. So it's painting that picture, and as a good historian guide, you need to be able to paint the battle from the inside out, not the outside in. And that was always my, well, I say at the start, as an ex-soldier and a historian, I'm here to get you inside the battle looking out rather than, looking outside in. And wargamers, they want that detail. They want to understand it. And particularly if they've not served in the military, they've got it all in their head, the order of battle, the equipment, all that. They just need to understand, well, how does that actually work? How much influence has a platoon commander got? And, and I'd say, okay, let's lie down on the floor. What? You say, okay, let's lie down on the floor. This is what you see. It's no good standing on a battlefield talking about guys in trenches or under fire, because nobody's standing up. And they go, and then they, oh, thanks for that. I get it. Now that's just that picture's painted 1,000 words straight away. Or
do you find
gamers couldn't get up once they got on the floor?
Do you find that your battlefield walking informs your wargaming, or do you find that your wargaming informs your battlefield walking?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's two ways. I think it's about equal, to be honest.
Right.
I mean, when I play here, the guys I play with, 3 of them are battlefield guides.
Right.
There's usually 4 of us, sometimes 5, and 4 of the 5 are ex-military. So, and amongst those are the battlefield guides. So, we've nearly all walked the ground. So we get some right arguments about which hedges was where and all the rest of it. But because that's the other thing, isn't it? We mentioned Waterloo earlier, but if you look at the aerial photograph of Oosterbeek immediately after the battle, it's far more rural in 44 than it is now. People go around it and say, oh, well, why didn't they do this and why didn't they do that? And say, no, it wasn't like that. And the perimeter was completely porous at night, particularly at night. So these are the things that you bring to the table. And if people go away with a much clearer understanding, that's good. And wargamers coming out from a very technical angle. They want to understand and know that stuff, and just understand how far it is. If you go back to Arnhem again, the distance from those landing zones in and why and the routes. I get into a real not argument, but there's always a discussion about the comms. There's always discussion about artillery support, etc. But and 3 routes. Why did Lathbury spread into 3 routes? And we all know why. Because he's worried about congestion. But and I have to rewind it and say, well, 48 hours before, if 2nd SS Panzer Corps wouldn't have been here. 7 days before, we'd come up with schedule. And that's the fascination about Waterloo and about Arnhem and so many others similar. Is those what-if moments, and you have to articulate those. Well, what if this? And that's what this going back to Rich's point about 3 agendas. People come with those agendas. They've latched onto 1 or 2 of those things. Oh well, if Urquhart hadn't have done this, or if Hackett had done that, or you think, well, Urquhart did front load all his gliders with as many anti-tank guns as he could, and Browning had taken all those gliders off to do his headquarters. Why had he done that? All these things, and so I think that's what the guide brings, that depth of what And they say, oh well, I can see this far, and you say, yeah, but they landed in September. There were no crops in the fields, or there was this, or there was that. So you're there to tell a story, to stimulate, but also to challenge sometimes and say, okay. And my favourite line was always, well, that is a point of view.
So Mike, we're talking about the you being a military man and a wargaming man, and you sent me a photo the other day of a game you were playing, I think, with your son, and I commented on how nicely dispersed your infantry squad was. Because obviously we very often see, you know, whole platoons squeezed in behind a garden shed, which kind of, you know, one grenade would kill the lot of them, kind of thing. What I'm guessing that's one of the frustrations of a military man when it comes to wargaming. Do you recognise that? Are there others?
Yeah, no, I think so, and it's the ability to just change a plan just like that instantly. A wargame, you know, the God's got over you. You say, well, and that's why we at least have arrows on a map. So everyone has a bit of paper for the honesty test. Okay, show me that plan. I don't believe that. You know, there it is. Okay, you know, or the umpire's going to do that. And that was my son Adam, and he made that table. That's a fantastic table he's done, and he's been an infantry platoon commander in Afghanistan. You know, so he knows his fieldcraft, and we're both the same. No, they wouldn't be there. There was always that healthy discussion about dispersion and cover. Yeah, and I do find interesting is, and what's why I like a lot of things in your rules is there's a bottle test in there. You know, people don't just respawn and go on fighting. And often when we're playing a game, even though the rules will say you can still fight on, you'll say, well, we've lost two tanks over there, this, that, and say there's no way that attack's going to carry on. In real terms.
That was certainly our attitude with when we wrote I Ain't Been Shot Mum. People would say, well, how does the game end? And we used to say, well, the game ends when it's not feasible for you to push on with the attack anymore. And we had to reevaluate that, and that's why we have things like the force morale test, because that's fine if you're dealing with military people who, you know, think the way military people think. They'll say, look, you know, it's a busted flush, I can't do it now. The force morale thing that we do with other rule sets from Dux Britannia and onwards does mean that you create that cut-off point where the boys will say, we're not going to do it. Let's go back and have some sausages.
I remember there, Rich, the pushback we got when we suggested that a machine gun could drive off a tank.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah.
There's kind of the rivet counter approach, isn't there?
But these are the human factors. These are the really important human factors, because if you're inside that tank and you're getting rattled to death and your optics are being shot out, and you're thinking, why is this guy firing a machine gun at me? He's firing a machine gun at me so the bazooka guy can get close enough to hit me. He's suppressing me. Yeah, that would be your first instinct, and you think, and even if there wasn't one, you think, I'm getting out of here. You know, let the infantry deal with that. So they're the kind of things you talk about, and I think are really important. And that's why, you know, wargaming. I mean, that game I sent you the photograph of. The terrain was so good. We got so close. It was grenade range before we started doing stuff. You know, it was cover and the visibility. You know, and I think that's important. And I find that the more realistic games, the more enjoyable. To be frank, and that's why the rules are so good. Yeah. So you guys, when you put your rule sets together, how do you evaluate national stereotypes or fighter capabilities, and how do you meld that into the rule set? How do you arrive at that?
That's a really good question.
History must have a part to play, a big part to play in that.
History's got a huge part to play, and actually it's a really good question, because one of the things we've got to try and avoid is stereotypes. And we've got to look at things. So national characteristics, I tend to look at the doctrine. I tend to look at the training manuals and also the reports of what people did when training, because I've got a manual that tells me how to use my video recorder, but I've never read it. So having the doctrine and the manuals and doing the drill are two different things. So it's, for example, I'm working on the Far East handbook for chain of command at the moment, and it's very easy to say all Gurkhas are brilliant, and you know, Gurkhas are, you know, bloodthirsty lunatics who never stop charging the enemy and whatever. And that's, you know, and yet you look at Burma in 42, and a lot of Gurkha battalions performed very, very badly because they were undertrained and they'd been milked of their officers. So it's important not to look at stereotypes, but to evaluate and judge based on performance. But there are three areas where we tend to look at what there is. So I'm looking at the quality of the troop training. So we could, on that basis, we could take the British Paras at Arnhem and say they were extremely well trained, very fit, well-trained troops. But did they have the experience? Were they the veterans that everybody paints them to be? And the answer to that is, well, you know, a lot of them had no experience of combat whatsoever. Yeah. So that's got to be another factor. Just because you can run 20 miles with a Bergen on doesn't mean that you're any good at the more important part of the job. The other thing we look at is leadership, because leadership and training are two very, very different things. You know, you can get troops who are extraordinarily fit and very well trained, but if they don't have the right quality of leadership, their performance can be relatively mundane. So I would suggest that if the concept of green troops, well, not so much green, but the concept of elite troops is a bit of a movable feast, really. The idea that somebody is elite, well, there's many, many factors that go together. And only when all of those threads arrive at the same place at the same time, the troops are well trained, the troops have got good doctrine, the troops are well supplied, the troops are well led, the troops understand the environment in which they're fighting. Only when all those things come together are you really going to get troops who behave as though they are elite.
And I think the thing that pieces all those together, Rich, is the term that I think you've used before, certainly, you know, Paddy Griffiths, tactical snippeting, where you're reading and you're seeing something in texts that are describing the way these men are fighting, and you'll say, well, actually, is that consistent with what I'm seeing and understanding from other sources, and patching that all together, you know. So we've been working on the Market Garden supplement, and as you know, the idea from there is actually the British Paras are not elite. If you look at the way they perform at Arnhem, there's no reason why you would give them that label. I mean, I always know that I'm putting myself up against the wall waiting to be shot by many, many people for that, but it doesn't quite feel that it would be right to give them the elite status. They don't behave in that way. The leadership isn't showing up in the way. And what spurred the conversation with me and you and the glider pilots was, what's the role of the glider pilots in this collapsing perimeter where you've got, I think, 1,200 additional NCOs that you know, oh, how fortunate that you've got these guys, you know, in that position, and are able to give you a real resilience when you are suffering a high rate of attrition in your junior leaders.
And their Bergens full of goodies.
Yeah, and you got to think about, and also certainly with 1st Airborne Division, elitism can work against you. You know, if you compare 1st and 6th Airborne Division and the way they perform and train and all of that. And another thing I find interesting is the tribalism. King's Own Border Regiment perform exceptionally well because of their training, the way they've been put together, and their mindset and the way they've been organised. The Air Landing Brigade do well, you know, do very well.
We were down at Merville Battery, and you look at 9th Parachute.
There's a set of orders. Wow.
Under Otway. You know, they were grabbed at the end of 40 or the beginning of 41 and said, right, you're going to be airborne now, because they were the 10th Battalion of the Essex Regiment, and they were told, right, you're going to be airborne now. When they went in at Merville, that's their first action of the war. And Otway, his first action of the war, and you can even, you know, I've watched him speak. I mean, obviously he's dead now, but I've watched the
video of him.
Video of him speaking, and you can tell that his personal wheels come off at certain key moments, and he's asking his Batman what to do.
And he bumped off his predecessor and he got rid of him.
Well, that's the story, isn't it? Yeah. That's the story. Whether we'll ever know exactly what happened there is
it's interesting as an example of when you talk about battlefield guarding, when you go to Merville, who I've got the time with a military group, I give them Otway's orders.
No. Yeah,
and you can see them going, oh my God, you know, it goes on forever and ever. And do you remember what you're doing? Do you know what you're doing?
Yeah.
And I did it with the Royal Irish who'd just come back from Afghanistan. And they said this. I said, what their syndicate discussion was, analyse the plan, how it turned out, you know, And they said it's very similar to what they'd experienced in Afghanistan themselves, where if you're given all the toys, you'll try and use them.
Yeah.
Same on a war games table.
Same on a war games table.
You're a King Tiger, you're going to use it, aren't you? You've got, whatever happens, you're going to try and get it on the table. You know, so there it is. I can see one from here.
Yeah.
There's always one lurking.
Yeah.
So, and the CO said, I've seen this in Afghanistan where we've been offered a B-1 bomber to attack a compound. You know, we've got a complete battalion with all the other bits, attack helicopters, and you sit there and you think, well, it's like every golf club in the bag's got to come out, and it doesn't. And then you look at it's different level, battalion versus company, but usually I'll go and we'll do Merville Battery and we'll do Pegasus Bridge, and it's a company and a battalion, and we'll compare the two plans and the two commanders and the way they go about their business and the results, how that works, because you know Otway's got so many moving. I mean, it is the toughest knot in the plan.
Yeah, without doubt. It reminds me a bit of H. Jones at Goose Green with his 9 phases of planning, and it just looked like the same sort of dog's dinner.
Yeah.
In many ways, I think he was better off that he ended up with a company-sized force, and he just got on and went back to his roots and did what he'd been trained to do. Let's lead a company into action and do what we can do. To an extent, it must have been a relief rather than trying to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I remember quite a few years ago, chastising an officer who gave a set of orders in front of me to a group of aviators off the back of a fag packet, literally written on a fag packet. And I said to him, "Sir, I did not look very, very professional, blah, blah. Why didn't you give a proper set of orders?" He said, "I don't need a notebook. I don't need a Nirex folder. If I can't give a set of orders off a fag packet, I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And it won't fit on a fag packet. It's too complicated."
Well, there's a lot of truth in that, isn't there?
Yeah. And
talk about Otway as well, Rich. You know, to what extent did Otway's success, his ability to succeed, come from the fact that he'd war gamed it through many times, you know, while he was planning the attack, and his ability to respond and change what he was doing to fit to his overall intent? Is that because he war gamed it?
Well, he had that incredible mock-up of it, didn't he?
Newbury, a Newbury
farmhouse somewhere, and the story of him pissing out the window, and that was quite an interesting bit of preparation. But it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because again, you know, the purpose of the ops room is to talk about what kind of tool wargaming can be, and certainly just having that 3D model, very much akin to a war games table, would have brought the ground to life.
Certainly. Yeah, I remember in '94 interviewing 3 of the glider pilots who do Pegasus Bridge, and they talked about the film, because they made the model and then they flew a camera through the model on the flight path they were going to fly. So it's a very early attempt at simulation. Yeah. And they could go and watch this film anytime they wanted, 24/7. They had a pass to get into the headquarters to go and watch that, and that made a huge difference. You know, and talking to them, you know, they also said we could have done that with our eyes shut, but actually on the night it was so bright we didn't need to. We could see everything, you know. So it's interesting to see the use of a model there and the wargaming that went on. Yeah. Do
you ever find that one of the things that Nick and I looked at doing some years ago was we went over to Normandy. Can we run a battlefield tour for wargamers where we go out, walk the ground during the day, look at it, and then in the evening we play the wargame? Well, we came to the conclusion that it was completely impossible, because after an end of a day walking around the battlefields, we just want to sit down, have a nice meal, open a bottle of Vino Collapso, and we weren't going to get up and start pushing figures around the table at that time. But do you see mileage for combining the battlefield tour with a war game? Maybe you come back and do it a week later or whatever.
No, I do. I mean, you've only got to look at the staff ride where you have the study day before you go.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the way to do it. When everyone's got their gander up, say, okay, before we go, we'll fight the war game. And then you fought the war game, you've got your own little battle and its results in your own stories. You say, oh, here we are at that bunker then, Charlie. Actually, you can see you wouldn't have got that grenade in because you wouldn't be able to get close enough or whatever. You know, or, you know, how would that have worked? So I think before you go and or after would be yeah. So definitely before you go to get it.
Because afterwards it's about then saying, well, actually, what do we need to do differently if we're going to war game this more accurately based on what we've just walked through and understood?
Yeah.
It would be interesting, wouldn't it?
I mean, you know, the instances we talked about, you know, the dip at Waterloo and all the other bits and bobs that we you know, and the Hougoumont, for example, it's only when you get there, and certainly Gallipoli, it's only when you get there you go, okay, I get it now.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's why Nick and I walk so many battlefields. You know, if we're ever over on the continent doing something completely unrelated, we'll make sure that we create time for a battlefield visit, because it informs us hugely in terms of what happened, but that then informs the way we develop and rules or scenarios.
Because otherwise, where do you get it from? You know, the number of people who base their understanding of the Battle of Waterloo on the old 77 film or whatever it is,
Rod Steiger, yeah,
with the Russian army, and that or the horrendous Battle of the Bulge film. You know, they think, oh, that's what. And you go, no, it's and they get there. Oh, the Somme. It's building a table flat. No, it's not. If you walk the Somme, it's far from flat. You understand the plan and why they did it the way they tried to do it, the way they tried to do it. So I think that and wargaming, if you can't actually walk the ground, the nearest thing you can get to it is to wargame it.
Okay, and I think that is a great note on which to end our chat. It's been hugely informative. I've really enjoyed having the conversation with you, Mike, and thank you very much to you for joining us and giving us an insight into your life as a historian and battlefield guide and your experiences in the military. And thank you to you, the listener, for listening in. We're sure that you enjoyed that, and we will be back in the ops room at some point in the near future talking wargaming to wargamers.